Today, at the White House press briefing on coronavirus pandemic, the very first question was about the time frame Americans should anticipate for when the situation might begin to get better in the United States. And in response to that question, Donald Trump said two words that seemed to shock the stock market into further losses, and surely came as a shock to most Trump voters, who polls show have mostly not taken the coronavirus pandemic seriously. Those two words that changed the world for those people today were July and August.
If Americans really were to band together and do what the White House is suggesting, how quickly you could turn this corner?
My favorite question, I ask it all the time. How many times, Anthony? I think I ask him that question every day, and I speak to Deborah, I speak to a lot of them. I get the opinion. So it seems to me that if we do a really good job, we'll not only hold the death down to a level that is much lower than the other way, had we not done a good job. But people are talking about July, August, something like that. So it could be right in that period of time where it washes through. Other people don't like that term, but where it washes through.
So is this the new normal until the height of the summer?
We'll see what happens, but they think August, could be July, could be longer than that. But I've asked that question many, many times.
That is by far the most reasonable answer Donald Trump has ever given to a question like that about the pandemic. It sent Wall Street on a spiral of further losses in the remaining minutes of the trading day after Donald Trump said July and August. They then ended with the worst single-day losses since the Black Monday crash of 1987 in the stock market. The words July and August surely came as a shock to Trump voters who get their news from the same defective sources Donald Trump uses. An NBC News poll released this weekend showed that Democrats already knew where this was going because none of them were believing what Donald Trump had to say about it. And most Republicans had no idea where we would be just 2 days after the poll was released. 79% of Democrats knew days ago that the worst was yet to come, and only 40% of Republicans knew that because they'd been listening to Donald Trump. The biggest reason for the Republican failure on this reality test was their belief in the words of Donald Trump. Here's what Donald Trump told those unfortunate people who believed him last month.
Now, the virus that we're talking about having to do, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat, as the heat comes in. Typically, that will go away in April.
April has now become July and August. And here is what the president said. Actually said this just 2.5 weeks ago.
When you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, that's a pretty good job we've done.
Yeah, that would have been a pretty good job. But that is not what happened. We now have at least 4,421 reported cases and at least 84 reported deaths in the United States. And today, 2.5 weeks after claiming that he personally was in charge of a government defense against the coronavirus that was going to get our cases down to zero, Donald Trump said he's doing a great job.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your response to this crisis?
I'd rate it a 10.
It's important to remember that no other president in history would have answered a question like that way. Every previous president would have recognized that the question was a test of his humility and his competence at the same time. And so every previous president would have found a way of defending his competence in the crisis, but would have humbly refused to give himself a grade. That is the minimally decent way for any human being to handle a question like that. But Donald Trump does not have minimal decency, which is why, once again today, Donald Trump did not speak one word of sorrow over the loss of life that this pandemic has wrought. Donald Trump did not say one word of sympathy to the people who have lost their loved ones to this pandemic. As usual, there wasn't a trace of feeling exhibited by Donald Trump today for the pain and tragedy that this pandemic has brought to the people of the United States and the world. In his briefing yesterday, Donald Trump did very clearly express a feeling, and he expressed it very convincingly. And it was the very first thing he said yesterday. He was so excited about it. And the feeling that Donald Trump expressed in response to a pandemic that is killing Americans and is on its way to making thousands and thousands of people sick in this country with a possible ultimate death toll in the millions around the world, the feelings Donald Trump felt in the face of all of that yesterday was happy.
Beautiful day outside, and I think we have some great things to talk about. I'll start by discussing the Federal Reserve. As you know, it just happened minutes ago, but to me it makes me very happy. And I want to congratulate the Federal Reserve. For starters, they've lowered the Fed rate from what it was, which was 1 to 1.25, and it's been lowered down to 0 to 0.25. 4.25, so it's 0 to 0.25. That's a big difference. It's quite a bit, about a point.